Hello, welcome to Notable Nobels, a podcast about the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. My name is Harrison Doolin. I'm a postdoctoral scientist at the Fred Hutch Cancer Center in Seattle, and I will be your host for this web series. The purpose of this series is to trace key advancements made in the biological and medical sciences over the past 120 to 150 years, using the Nobel Prizes in Physiology or Medicine as a guide. Now, every career has its highest prize, and for scientists, that prize is the Nobel Prize. It's the most prestigious award a scientist can receive, and it marks discoveries that have made a profound impact on our understanding of biology and our ability to treat diseases. Today, we will be examining one half of the 1976 Prize in Physiology or Medicine, which was awarded to Barack S. Blumberg and D. Carleton Gajdusek. The Nobel Assembly at the Karolinska Institute chose to give Blumberg and Gajdusek the award, quote, for their discoveries concerning new mechanisms for the origin and dissemination of infectious diseases, unquote. We covered Blumberg's half of the award in episode 20 of this podcast, and today we'll cover Gajdusek's half of the award. We'll be looking at an outbreak of a rare neurodegenerative disease, how Gajdusek showed that an infectious agent was responsible for that disease, and how this infectious agent was unlike anything previously studied in biology. We begin our story today by journeying to the Pacific island of New Guinea. Picture, if you will, a beautiful tropical paradise, with lowland plains in the south and mountains in the north. The island is large. It's the second largest island in the world after Greenland, with rich biological diversity. Take a trip to the interior and you'll see strange marsupials like the tree kangaroo, birds and bats of all shapes and sizes fill the trees, and between the trees you might see the cassowary, a dinosaur-looking bird that stands over 5 feet tall. Reptiles are abundant here, from crocodiles in the rivers to 10-foot-long pythons in the trees. Thousands of years ago, the first humans arrived in New Guinea from Southeast Asia, and they spread out over the island. The mountainous regions and rivers served to isolate people from each other as they spread out, so over time, distinct people groups and languages developed. Our story today will focus on the Foray people who live in the eastern highland mountains of Papua New Guinea. About 20 to 30,000 Foray people live in scattered tribes and villages where they practice the farming of pigs and root vegetables, and in the past engaged in both trade and warfare with surrounding peoples. One of the truly remarkable things about the Foray people is how incredibly long they remained isolated from the outside world. In fact, their first contact with Westerners was less than 100 years ago. Europeans had arrived on the island of New Guinea during the Age of Exploration in the 16th and 17th centuries, but most European activity was restricted to mapping the coast, and little was known about the island or its inhabitants for many centuries after its discovery by Westerners. Even when Europeans eventually started exploring the island in the 19th century, they mostly stayed in the lowlands. Europeans assumed the mountainous highland regions were uninhabited and ignored them for decades. Of course, knowing nothing about an area didn't stop various colonial powers from laying claim to it. Spanish, Dutch, German, British, and Australian colonial governments all laid claim to the island at one time or another. World War I saw conflict between the German and Australian forces in eastern New Guinea, which Australia won. In 1920, the Australian government became the administrators of the territory of New Guinea in the east, while the Dutch colonial government administered the territory in the west. These governments still held the belief that the mountainous regions of the island were uninhabited. It wasn't until the 1930s that expeditions began into the mountains. To their very great surprise, the Europeans found that the mountains were not uninhabited after all. In fact, over 3 million Stone Age peoples were living in highland tribes and farming villages. On one memorable occasion, a zoological expedition in 1938, led by the American Richard Archbold, flew a plane over a previously unexplored and presumably uninhabited valley. You can imagine their shock when they saw the valley was home to over 50,000 people and their livestock. Similar expeditions in the 1930s eventually reached the Foray people in the Eastern Highlands. But it wasn't until the late 1940s that official colonial government contacts reached the Foray. It really blows my mind that an entire people group was hidden away in the mountains of New Guinea while all of World War I and World War II raged around it. D-Day, Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Iwo Jima, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of that happened before regular contact was established with the Foray people, which is just crazy. Now, maybe at this point you're saying to yourself, oh, that's really cool and all, but this is a podcast about the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, and you haven't said a word about anything medical yet. Well, you're right, so let's dive into the unusual disease that was afflicting the Foray people. The Foray called the disease Kuru, which is the Foray word for shaking or trembling. The disease had come upon the Foray people relatively recently. According to their oral history, cases began in the 1920s and were increasing every year. At the onset of disease, the sick person begins to lose control of their muscle movements. Their walk becomes shaky, they might develop a tremor, and may have some difficulty speaking. At first, the symptoms will be slight, and they can compensate by using a cane or a walking stick, but as the disease progresses, they will eventually lose the ability to walk, and the tremors will become more severe. They will also begin to show clinical signs of dementia. The disease eventually results in complete loss of muscle control, including the ability to swallow food or to speak. The afflicted individual eventually dies from malnutrition, infection, or some combination of the two. Depressingly, death is the outcome 100% of the time. Once a person begins showing signs of the disease, death occurs in 1 year or less. Even more depressing, among the Foray people, the disease had a preference for killing women and children. From the late 1940s to late 1970s, Kuru killed nearly 3,000 Foray people, which was a big hit to a community of only about 30,000 people. In the face of all this death, the Foray people began looking for ways to stop Kuru. The question they had to ask themselves, and the question we will be asking ourselves for the rest of this podcast episode, was this: what causes Kuru? Knowing what causes a disease is the first step in trying to do something to prevent or treat it, and the Foray people knew this. However, their explanation for what causes Kuru was off the mark. The Foray believed that Kuru was the result of black magic being performed by a rogue sorcerer. None of their attempts to find and kill this rogue sorcerer came to anything, however. So, if sorcery wasn't what caused Kuru, then what did? This question would be taken up by the Europeans once they arrived on the scene. The first recorded case of Kuru by Westerners was in 1951, once the Foray established regular contact with the outside world. The Westerners naturally did not believe the disease was caused by sorcery, and instead began looking for possible biological explanations for the disease. One of the early ideas was that Kuru might be a previously unknown inherited genetic disease. If this was true, then Kuru should be restricted to certain families. Researchers therefore constructed genealogies by interviewing the Foray people, as well as epidemiological data of Kuru cases, and they then compared the two. The pattern that emerged did not support a genetic origin of Kuru. The researchers were able to document some of the first cases of Kuru in specific family groups, meaning these individuals had no known family members with the disease, making it highly unlikely the disease was an inherited genetic disease. Instead, the epidemiological data suggested that Kuru was spreading like an infectious disease, although a highly unusual one. It spread much slower than other known pathogens, and it had this unusual bias towards women and children. Additionally, individuals with Kuru did not develop fevers or inflammation, which are common indications of an infection. So, while the epidemiological data seemed to suggest that Kuru was an infectious disease, it wasn't proof that Kuru was an infectious disease. Now, if it was the case that Kuru really was an infectious disease, well then what kind of pathogen was responsible? These questions into the nature of Kuru were faced head-on by Carleton Gajdusek, our Nobel laureate for today's episode. Carleton Gajdusek has been described as a man who was interested in anything and everything. He was an incredibly eccentric individual, very talkative and kind of vain. Some of his eccentricities took him into unethical territory at times, which later in life got him into serious trouble with the law, but his roots as a scientist stemmed from pure delight in the natural world. Gajdusek was born in 1923 in Yonkers, New York, an inner suburb of New York City. His father was a Slavic immigrant who worked as a butcher, and his mother was the daughter of Hungarian immigrants. From an early age, Gajdusek wanted to be a scientist. This was due in part to his mother's love of reading, which she instilled in all of her children, but it was mostly due to the influence of his scientist aunt, Irene Dabrowski, who worked as an entomologist at the Boyce-Thompson Institute in Yonkers. Irene's work took her on trips to Southeast Asia and the Philippines, and she'd return from these trips with exotic artifacts and insects and fantastic stories about trekking through the jungle, and these really gripped her nephew. Irene took the young Gajdusek to scientific meetings at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, and when he was a teenager, he spent his summers working in an organic chemistry lab at the Boyce-Thompson Institute. All of these experiences cemented Gajdusek's desire to be a scientist. Gajdusek attended the University of Rochester after finishing high school. He earned his undergrad degree in 1943 and then went to Harvard Medical School, graduating with his MD degree in 1946. He spent the next several years doing postdoctoral work at various institutions around the country before being drafted into the U.S. Army in 1951. He worked as a research virologist during his time in the Army, where he found a passion for being a sort of explorer scientist doctor. Here's how he described his research at this time. Quote, "I learned of the excitement and challenge offered by urgent opportunistic investigations of epidemiological problems in exotic and isolated populations. My quest for medical problems in primitive population isolates took me to the valleys of the Hindu Kush, the jungles of South America, the coast and inland ranges of New Britain, and the swamps and high valleys of Papua New Guinea and Malaysia." Unquote. After being discharged from the Army in 1954, Gajdusek set up his own lab at the U.S. National Institutes of Health. The focus of his lab was the, quote, "study of child growth and development and disease patterns in primitive cultures," unquote. If that sounds like a mouthful, that's because there really wasn't a word for the field of medicine Gajdusek was pursuing. Nowadays, we probably wouldn't use the word primitive culture, but we also would call what he was doing medical anthropology or biomedical anthropology. Biomedical anthropology is the study of how genetics, the environment, and human behavior intersect to influence human health. For Gajdusek, this meant learning everything about Stone Age societies to see how their unique environments, genetics, and cultural practices impacted their health. Not long after starting his lab, his focus turned to the Kuru disease affecting the Foray people. Gajdusek had heard about Kuru from his colleagues in Australia, and he was intrigued by this obscure and deadly disease. He arrived in New Guinea in 1957 to begin studying Kuru. He went around collecting observations about the symptoms of the disease, as well as collecting biological material for analysis back at his lab at the NIH. Gajdusek wanted to test the hypothesis that Kuru was an infectious disease. Gajdusek had been working as a virologist, and he believed that Kuru might be caused by some kind of undiscovered microorganism. So, how would he go about testing that hypothesis? Well, the gold standard of proving a microorganism is the cause of a disease is Koch's postulates, which we talked about all the way back in episode 4 of this podcast. So, let's briefly review. To fulfill Koch's postulates and prove a microorganism causes disease, the microorganism suspected of causing the disease must be present in diseased tissue but be absent from healthy tissue. This creates a correlation between the disease and the presence of the microbe. The microbe must be isolated from the diseased tissue and maintained in pure culture separate from other microbes, and inoculation of the cultured microbe into a susceptible host must reproduce the original symptoms of the disease. Finally, the same microbe must be isolated again from the inoculated diseased host. Now that all sounds well and good, but as we mentioned before, Koch's postulates can be kind of difficult to fulfill, especially for unconventional diseases, but Gajdusek decided he'd have a go at it. Gajdusek took tissue samples from deceased Kuru victims and started looking for the suspected microbe, hoping to fulfill Koch's postulates. Since Kuru was a degenerative disease of the brain tissue was where he looked first. He examined brain slices under microscopes to look for the presence of microbes such as viruses or bacteria. However, no microbes were seen. Attempts to use diseased tissue to grow the suspected microbes in cell culture also failed to produce anything. This was disappointing, but not entirely unexpected. Lots of microbes require very specific growth conditions that are difficult to reproduce in the lab. Though he hadn't yet identified a candidate microbe responsible for Kuru, Gajdusek decided to try to reproduce the original symptoms of the disease in an animal model. Attempts to reproduce the symptoms of Kuru in rodents all failed. Again, this was not unexpected, as many microbes have a very narrow host range that they can infect. Usually, the best chance of reproducing a human disease in an animal host is to use primates. Primates, particularly great apes, have biology that is most like humans, so they are more likely to be susceptible to human pathogens. Gajdusek and his colleagues, therefore, decided to set up an experiment in primates to see if they could reproduce Kuru in these animals. The scientists took a suspension of brain tissue from individuals who had died of Kuru and injected this suspension directly into the brains of 3 female chimpanzees. They then sat back and waited. 6 months later, and the chimps were fine. A year went by, and the chimps were still fine. A year and a half into the experiment, and the chimps still showed no signs of Kuru. Maybe at this point the scientists were starting to have serious doubts about their hypothesis, but they kept the experiment going anyways. Then finally, something happened. Between 18 and 21 months after injecting the brain material, all 3 chimps developed Kuru. This was positive proof that Kuru was indeed an infectious disease. Gajdusek and his team published their results in the journal Nature in 1966, and it generated a great deal of interest and additional questions. Gajdusek and the scientific field had 2 big questions remaining about Kuru. Number 1, what was the infectious agent responsible for transmitting the disease? And number 2, how did it spread? One answer to the question of how Kuru spread had actually been proposed a few years before Gajdusek and his team published their results. A pair of anthropologists working with the Foray people had been documenting the spread of Kuru, and they believed they had traced the source of Kuru to a specific cultural practice among the Foray. This was the practice of endocannibalism. Endocannibalism is a form of cannibalism that involves consuming the remains of a deceased community member, usually as a type of funerary practice. Among the Foray, endocannibalism was a religious ceremony meant to ensure the safe progress of the soul of the deceased person, as well as a way for the deceased person to spiritually bless their living relatives. It was also a way for the community to express their love for the deceased person. You see, to the Foray, it was more loving for a deceased person to be eaten by their family than by maggots and worms after burial in the ground. Now, 2 observations about endocannibalism among the Foray led to the suggestion that this cultural practice might be responsible for the spread of Kuru. The first observation was that the preparation of the body for consumption was done by women with the help of children, and men rarely handled the uncooked flesh. The scientists theorized that the reason Kuru had a preference for killing women and children was because they were the ones who handled the dead body and prepared it for consumption, which included handling the diseased brain tissue. The second observation was that cases of Kuru had been declining among the Faroe as the practice of endocannibalism was suppressed and ultimately abolished by the Western government and missionaries, who understandably wanted to put a stop to the practice. In the Judeo-Christian West, the dead are honored by preserving their remains in the hope of eventual bodily resurrection by God, so to state the obvious, cooking and eating a deceased person is seen as very taboo. By 1959, the practice of endocannibalism among the Faroe was abolished, and by the middle of the 1960s, it was observed that no new cases of Kuru had been observed in anyone born after 1959. The correlation of the end of endocannibalism and the end of Kuru in a new generation of Faroe suggested to researchers that Kuru was spread by the practice of endocannibalism. Gajdusek's results reproducing Kuru in chimpanzees by infecting them with diseased brain closed the loop on the transmission cycle of Kuru. Kuru was indeed an infectious disease, and it was spread among the Faroe people when they came into contact with diseased tissue as a part of their funerary cannibalistic customs. The end of the practice of endocannibalism also led to the eradication of Kuru among the Faroe, which is a fascinating story in the archives of biomedical anthropology. But there still remained the microbiology question of what was the infectious agent that caused Kuru. Was it a parasite, a virus, a bacteria, a fungus? Well, having shown that Kuru was an infectious disease, Gajdusek now turned his attention back to this question. As mentioned earlier, examination of diseased tissue from Kuru patients with microscopes, even very powerful microscopes, failed to produce any sign of a microorganism that could explain Kuru. However, now that he had a primate model of the disease, there were some experiments that Gajdusek could do that would help him identify the characteristics of the infectious agent. One of the first steps was to figure out the size of the infectious agent. Gajdusek took infected brain material and passed it through filters that would catch anything the size of a bacteria or bigger. He then took what went through the filter and used it to infect chimpanzees. The result was that the chimps again developed Kuru. This meant that whatever the infectious agent was, it was smaller than bacteria, which led Gajdusek to believe it must be some new kind of virus. But if it was a virus, then it was a very strange virus. As mentioned earlier, Kuru patients did not develop fevers or inflammation, which are common indications of an infection. Kuru patients didn't make antibodies against the infectious agent, nor did they produce interferons, which are virus-fighting molecules produced by infected cells. Even more strangely, Gajdusek found that the Kuru agent was remarkably resistant to treatments that would kill normal viruses. The Kuru agent was stable at high temperatures, was resistant to treatment with chemicals such as formaldehyde, and would survive treatment with certain enzymes like proteases. Most strange of all, the Kuru agent could survive treatment with ultraviolet light and gamma radiation. These methods of virus inactivation destroy virus nucleic acids. The fact that the Kuru agent could survive these treatments raised the category-busting idea that maybe the Kuru agent didn't contain nucleic acids, and maybe it could replicate without the need for nucleic acid. That was big. If this was true, this was a colossal shift in our understanding of infectious diseases and of life in general. Every living thing on this planet was known to replicate by means of nucleic acids, either DNA or RNA. If Gajdusek was correct, this opened a whole new category of what it means to be a living thing on this planet. Now, these exciting possibilities caught the interest of the Nobel Committee, and in 1976, Gajdusek was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. You might be wondering if Gajdusek's Nobel Prize, while well-deserved, was maybe a little bit premature. After all, while he'd been making excellent progress characterizing Kuru and its infectious agent, he still didn't technically know what that agent was, only that it was clearly different from anything studied up until that point. Gajdusek still believed that the Kuru agent was some sort of unconventional virus, and in his Nobel lecture he mentioned that the molecular nature of this quote-unquote unconventional virus was still a major focus of his lab. Well, it turned out that Kuru was not caused by a virus, but belonged to a brand new class of infectious diseases. This new category of infectious agents came to be called prions. The molecular nature of prions and how they replicate themselves would be worth its own Nobel Prize, and that will be the subject of our next podcast episode. So sorry that you only get half the story today, but listen next time for the exciting second half. That being said, there's still some things we can say in conclusion about the story of Kuru. Kuru is a great example of biomedical anthropology in action. It shows how extensively human behavior and infectious diseases are intertwined. Kuru was spread because of a specific human behavior, endocannibalism, and the cessation of endocannibalism also led to the end of Kuru. It's been over a decade since the last reported fatality of Kuru, and no one born since endocannibalism ended has had Kuru. It's remarkable that Kuru declined on its own without knowing what caused it. The message I get from this is that we can make major progress in human health even when we don't have the full molecular picture behind what causes a disease. Aside from the important cellular and molecular interventions like drugs and vaccines, behavioral interventions can hold a great deal of power in combating infectious disease outbreaks and can be a remarkably effective way to curb diseases. The most obvious example of this in practice in recent memory is the COVID-19 pandemic, where behavioral interventions such as social distancing and masking were put in place to help slow the spread of the virus. However, one of the problems with using behavioral interventions as a strategy to combat disease is that people don't really like being told that they need to change what they're doing. Just like we saw pushbacks against the social interventions enacted during the COVID-19 pandemic, the 4A people pushed back against efforts to end their cultural rituals, and it took almost a decade for cannibalism to be fully stopped. It's honestly still a bit of an open question about what the best way is to create behavioral and cultural changes for the sake of public health. Nevertheless, the intersection of human health and human behavior will remain a major area of research and discussion in the years ahead. Okay, that concludes this episode of Notable Nobels. This episode was recorded on February 28th, 2025. I want to thank Digital Mind Productions for providing the music and Nicholas Wynn for the graphic design. Next time we'll be covering part 2 of prion diseases, including their molecular nature, and we'll be covering some of the current prion diseases that public health officials are monitoring. Want to know more? Well, listen next time to find out. Thanks so much for listening. See you then.